I can't figure out why everyone doesn't vote. So that's my naive perspective on the world, because that is your power. That's how you make yourself known, and that's how you really get things done, when you're able to not only vote your interests but organize around it and make sure that those who are elected officials actually hear you and register your complaints and your concerns and your willingness to be engaged. So it's difficult for me to understand why we don't. We're probably at 82% of all of those who are eligible to vote who are registered now. I know that we've gotten most of the low-hanging fruit, so we're now at the top of the tree, and we're working in every community that we can to see, and with every group that we can, to see how we can expand that.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Ariel. I'm a reporter on the politics team. So to get started, we wanted to ask a few questions to help voters get to know you better before we get into the issues directly related to your job. The first is, what do people most get wrong about California?
Well, I think everyone believes that California is probably the most liberal state in the world, and as a result, they think there's no controversy when it comes to anything that might be somewhat conservative. And I think we've learned over the years that you can't really predict California that well, that there are a lot of things that we do that are very different than what people anticipate. And so the world thinks of California as this place where everything goes, and then they're shocked when certain things don't pass in the legislature and people have other issues that are there. So California is very diverse, and so its opinions are very diverse, and so we have to be ready and recognize that.
Got it. So what's the most difficult thing you've had to do in your life?
In my life? Wow. I don't think we have that much time. And I say that because, you know, I came out of the Jim Crow South with my parents, and had difficulty getting here, and then we were struggling as a large family living in the projects and those kinds of things. And, you know, and being African American and a woman, all combined with those things, makes life very difficult, and the challenge is great. So I don't think I can tell you the most difficult thing I've done, because I've adapted to life that whatever's going to happen is probably going to happen and be very hard for me as an African American and a woman. But I have the skills necessary to basically overcome them.
Do you think there's anything in particular that you point to as really influencing your work or your career now, from those experiences that you've mentioned?
I think what probably has impacted what I do is the fact that I spend a lot of time getting to know people, because I've discovered that if I just simply write it off and say, well, you know, I'm black and they're white or they're this or that I don't get very far. And so I've spent a lot of time in my life having to get to know people, whether it's at the schools, at the competitions I've been in, because so often I've been the only person in a room, you know, the only African American at a speech contest or something of that nature. And at UCLA, one of 300 out of 30,000 students. So I think that experience itself has equipped me to really get beyond what the facade is that people have and really get to know who they are. And that has served me well in the legislature, because some of the most unlikely folks are my friends and have helped me with legislation and those kinds of things that people couldn't figure out why they would do that, because because of the race issue and the gender issue and being from San Diego and somebody else being from a rural area and all those kinds of things. But I've learned that not to judge from just the onset, but to make sure that I get to know people. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Also, what's a political issue that you've changed your mind about?
You know, I try not to have hard and fast rules about political issues, and I think I've learned a little bit more about issues that deal with our rural communities and how they operate and those kinds of things as a result of having some friends in those communities that have needs. And so where you could just write it off and say, you know, based on the numbers, this is where we are. I've often had to change my viewpoint about that and make sure that I was treating other communities as fairly as I was treating my own community, that everybody has a challenge that's there. And so I've had to kind of soften my views. I don't know if I dramatically changed from one thing to the other, but surely have come to understand why folks oppose certain things and how I had to work to mediate those things.
Thank you for that. I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Samia.
Hello, I'm Samia Kamal. I'm also a reporter on the politics team. So getting into some questions about the job, what has been your most important accomplishment in the post so far?
Well, I think You know, when I entered this job, I entered in a, you enter in a strange place because this was the most unusual year, 2021. And we had lots and lots of elections coming out of 2020. My staff told me we've done like maybe 25, where you normally don't have any until you get to a primary the next year. So it became really quick that I had to learn. I was in the middle of somebody else's administration, and I had to get staff. I had to come up on the issues, and so that was a difficult task, number one. Facing the challenges, there have been some unique challenges in the Secretary of State's office around the CARS project, obviously. And that's been a unique challenge that probably I hadn't anticipated, and I had to work hard to figure out the direction we were going to go. Same was true with CBC, to a certain extent, the business project. But those were the things that were difficult, as well as, you know, falling into a recall election where I'm sued by everybody, including the governor, about issues concerning recall, and wanting to make sure that we didn't bundle the job so that those who didn't win were constantly complaining about whether or not we had been fair and just in the recall. And I think we did an excellent job in doing that. That was a difficult task to do. I've had to reorganize a number of things in Secretary of State's office, and so as a result, most folks don't see them. They're more internal, and those were difficult things to do, but we were able to accomplish them.
And if you win a second term, what are your top 2 priorities?
In a second term, clearly, you know, continuing the registration and the implementation of strong elections is always a top priority that's there. But in addition to that, there's so many other things that we have to do. And one of those things we need to do is to support our businesses and our nonprofits better. And we're working on it on a project now to try to basically help small businesses do a better job with what they're doing. They're able to navigate CBC through in terms of getting things done, but making sure that we're meeting their needs. And so we're going to do some outreach to small businesses to make sure that they understand what the Secretary of State's office can do and not do for them. But we also want to work with our nonprofits, because many of them lost their nonprofit status during COVID because they didn't know how to file papers. And these are the small ones. These are not the biggies. These are the small ones. We had lots of churches and others that did not. So I want to make sure that people know what resources we have, and we're already planning for the next term to talk about how we can do more town halls, more meetings, make sure that we have things on our website that really address the issue of small businesses as well as our nonprofits.
And how would you better coordinate and communicate with county election officials?
Well, one of the first things I did with our county was, as soon as I went into office, I made contact with all of them, even during COVID. Within a month, I had at least an hour call or so with every county registrar voter, because I wanted them to know who I was and that I was there, and see me in person, know that I was going to be a partner with the counties and provide them with the assistance and help they need. So we've done that, and we want to continue to do that with all of our counties. I've visited a lot of them. It's been difficult while you're managing elections I don't like to interrupt their work, and so we've got another number of them that we're still going to visit and to work with them. So in our second term, so we want to make sure that our counties understand, and they do. And I meet with them every month. We have Zoom calls every month concerning what's happening, the issues that are there. My legal staff is there to help them, because oftentimes in small counties, particularly registrar voters, they don't have a lot of support. They don't have a legal team. They don't have those things. So if we don't provide them with the legal assistance, they almost have nothing. So we've been working well with our counties, and me attending the various meetings and making, I guess I have a monthly meeting with all of the counties.
I'm just a follow-up to that. I'm curious, since the county officials do administer the elections, is there any possibility you see of increasing finance or, pushing for more in the budget for counties to be able to administer the elections effectively?
Well, we've seen, as a result of us giving more resources to county, because they did get more resources for the recall and some other things, that they were able to do a lot more. We're in the process of looking at all of our outreach and involving our counties, because a lot of things they could do better if they had more money. And so that's our goal we're working on a budget project now to hopefully increase our outreach, increase our resources to our counties, so that they can, especially the small counties, so they can do some of the things they would like to do in terms of outreach. They will be our key contact most of the time in outreach work that we do, and so we want to make sure that we give them resources to do it. So we're working on a very comprehensive proposal right now, and we hope to have it ready by December or January.
Is there a dollar figure attached?
Not yet, because we don't want to lowball ourselves or either be unrealistic in our requests. We're looking at what resources we currently have in the Secretary of State's office, because there are resources that deal with outreach. We've restructured our outreach efforts to around what we do statewide, but also around our counties. And so we're getting the information now to see, how many additional people we might need in different areas, and what we do and how we can support our counties with their outreach efforts that they have.
And you would expect that to be in the governor's budget proposal?
We hope it will be. If it's not in his proposal, it will be a budget proposal change that we're requesting.
And moving to voter activity, do you see it as important to increase voter participation?
It's extremely important. I can't figure out why everyone doesn't vote. So that's my naive perspective on the world, because that is your power. That's how you make yourself known, and that's how you really get things done, when you're able to not only vote your interests, but organize around it and make sure that those who are elected officials actually hear you and register your complaints and your concerns and your willingness to be engaged. So it's difficult for me to understand why we don't. We're probably at 82% of all of those who are eligible to vote who are registered now. I know that we've gotten most of the low-hanging fruit, so we're now at the top of the tree, and we're working in every community that we can to see, and with every group that we can, to see how we can expand that. We want to make sure that folks who's passed concepts of voting, we still have a lot of folks who believe because they have felonies and those kinds of things that they can't vote. So we're getting into those communities and those churches to help people understand that anybody who's walking the streets who's a U.S. citizen in California can probably vote. And so we're working on that with all of our efforts outreach. And so we know that the last 18% is going to be the hard 18% to get.
Do you have any specific plans for how to reach that 18%?
Yes, we're in, every opportunity we have, we not only put it on our website in terms of people voting, but we're in a lot of different places. We do town halls. We were in a town hall in Fresno at Sac State this week. We've got another town hall coming up. We've been to Fresno. We've been to a number of campuses, and as a town hall that brings not only the students but also people from the community. We got our drive going on with our college students. We're almost, and we've almost registered since the student project began 1,000,000 16, 17-year-olds to vote. We're at 900 and some odd number of thousand young people who are registered to vote at 16. We're getting our young people involved in not only just registering to vote in advance, but hopefully working in the polls, because we think once you become engaged in a political process, you continue to be engaged. So we're trying to grow our young people, because that's our challenge. The lowest voter turnout really is among 18 to 25-year-olds. Trying to help them understand why it's important, what they can get out of voting. And so when I go places to do workshops or discussions with them, I'll be at Cal Poly this Friday, so almost every invitation I get to come to a university and a community, I go to help young people understand why their vote is so powerful and why it's so necessary. So we're working with all of the entities. We're also working with a number of community-based organizations who specialize in different areas and getting in those communities to basically register people to vote. We're explaining to people that it's probably the easiest time ever to be able to vote, simply because of our vote by mail programs, our VCAs, and more days, more ways to vote kind of campaign. All those kinds of things are out there, and it's making it a lot easier for folks to vote. And so we want to make sure that they understand that as we go into the various communities to do that.
On top of that, are there any additional strategies that you think need to be employed to reach more non-white and other underrepresented communities?
Well, I have asked for that and gotten somewhat of the support from the various caucuses in the legislature. We've developed something called the Ambassador Program, where we're going into different communities that are there to get them enrolled. We just recently met with the YMCA in LA, who has a civics program with about, 60 or 70 different young people up and down the state, whose task is to work with their churches, their communities, and their young people in the Y to make sure that they're registered to vote. As I say, we go everywhere there is to go, and we tell folks if there's someplace we haven't been, tell us. We're at all of the swearing-ins for new citizens and registering people at those places. So my staff is either at one now or will be sometime this week in the morning, early morning, for those who are coming in as new citizens. We want to make sure that they understand their opportunity. We're working with our prisons to make sure that when they leave prison, they're informed that they now have a right to vote. So we're looking at workshops that we can do with them to make sure they understand it. We're also working with the community groups. There's a number of community groups who are very committed to this, and we worked with them last year because they had a budget proposal. It didn't get funded. So we're working with them now and it may have been because it was a whole lot of issues concerning the budget and what have you, but we hope to be able to incorporate them into our plan of outreach, so that because they're probably at the base level of communities that we can get to hopefully register them to vote. So we're working with every community we can find that we can, and going into every place that we can to get people registered to vote. We're not just doing the traditional things. We also do a lot of social media. Young people love social media. So we have a lot of social media going on about voting, and we respond to misinformation and disinformation when we see it on social media. So we're working at that level, yeah.
Hi there, Alexei Kotsek, cover the Capitol. We've talked many times before when you were in the Assembly. I wanted to ask you some questions about the ballot measure and referendum process, since you oversee that. And to start, do you think that the signature requirement levels are at the right, that we have the right requirements for qualifying ballot measures onto the ballot at this time? Or do you think that we need to rethink, higher or lower levels, timeline, anything like that to reach a better balance on?
Yeah, we're in the process of looking at that right now, and I haven't necessarily formed an opinion that we're too high, because I think the intent of the law initially was to deal with grassroots people who wanted to try to get something on the ballot. So I'm not in the business of trying to make it harder for people to get on the ballot. I know we've tried a whole lot of things in the legislature to manipulate this and manipulate that, so we don't just end up being only those who have money can get things on the ballot, those kind of things. So I'm not sure if raising the number of signatures I think it would probably lock out the grassroots individuals and make them feel that they can't get anything on the ballot. So I'm not into that, and I know California likes propositions. They like the ability to also legislate themselves. And I can understand why, having been in the legislature, that some things just get locked in politics and you can't get them out, and so that's frustrating to a lot of community people if they can't get things done through their elected officials, or they can get some of the elected officials to go with it, but not enough to get it on a ballot. That they have no other recourse other than to deal with that, to try to get it on the ballot. And so I understand that, the necessity of it. Probably if I were outside, I may not understand it, but having been inside and trying to get things done, I realize that there's sometimes a high level of frustration on issues that should be done that are locked in the political world. And many of the elected officials kind of like that when they can take something to the ballot, because then they don't get the heat themselves for standing up for certain issues. It kind of releases them from that responsibility of having to work on issues that are highly controversial. So I don't think it's too high. I think all of us have a concern that it takes a lot to get on a ballot, and that sometimes only those with resources and money, and you see that in the ads and the commercials that are just going at each other and confusing folks as to what it really is. So I wouldn't, in terms of the initiatives itself, I would not change or say that, we need to make it harder. No, we don't. With what we have initiatives on the ballot. Sometimes we have an awful lot of them. This time we have maybe, about 6 or so, something like that. Yeah, so it's not an enormous number of ballot initiatives when you consider that this is a state of 40 million people.
What about with the referendum process? Because something that we've seen become a very common thing over the last few election cycles is that there's a law the legislature passes that a certain industry doesn't like, and then they qualify a referendum. So do you think that process is working as it should, or are there changes that should be made? I mean, some laws can end up being on hold for almost 2 years as a result.
And those are the ones that I think that I look at and I feel that it's unfortunate that happens, and we need to look at and see whether or not there need to be even a higher threshold of passing those things, because there are lots of and you probably know them better than I. Lots of initiatives that have been struggled with in the legislature. We have one that's coming up this time that the flavored tobacco, whatever it is. One of those that I even fought for on the floor and what have you, and now it's on referendum. And my concern is that that the message will be so twisted that people will be confused. And so those who struggle to get it done don't have probably the resources to fight back as the tobacco industry might have. So it's that in itself, plus the same thing happened with bail. After years and years and years of negotiating and figuring out a system that might be a little bit fairer, wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, and we lost it in a referendum. And so those are the kinds of things that when I look at, and we haven't had the time to do it this time because we had so many other things going on, is that one of the things I want to look at it, and we publish our booklet, and it's really, I read it the other day, and it's fairly clear about what it does and doesn't do, but I don't know if everybody reads it, which they probably don't. And so I think, and yet when you begin to get into it and try to have a pro and con discussion, then you almost seem partisan because they'll claim that because you're looking at it. But I understand there is a process that's either in Oregon or Washington one that I want to look at as to how we can better serve in terms of information so that people know what they're voting for. I can't tell you how many people who voted against in the last initiative with the bail were shocked that they voted to take it away. They didn't understand, and the commercials were so confusing that they got rid of something that had been negotiated for many, many years, not only in the legislature, but with the Supreme Court and all the judges, and trying to find a fair way. And most folks thought they were voting for one thing and voted against it. And so those kind of things are sad. And I think we have to look at how we can, in an impartial way, get more information to folks. I think it's in our booklet, and I'd encourage everybody to read our voter information guide, because it really is rather clear what you get and what it means when you vote yes versus no. But for whatever reason, we're in a society that doesn't do a lot of that reading of paper. Everybody's got something else. And so I told them we're going to have to look to see how we can better communicate what the initiatives really are, what they really are. Because when you talk to people, they don't want us to take them away. That's their safety net. But then they're frustrated because it can easily be bought.
So it sounds like you don't want to mess with the process itself, but you may want to reconsider how information about them is shared. Do you have any specifics maybe from those Oregon or Washington examples that you would want to share?
I understand the Washington and Oregon group from listening to a panel and some folks I was on who do this much more deeply, that they have that comes from the Secretary of State, and it would probably be very much like our voter information guide, and that's why I want to see if there's any difference in it, where they do have a panel of individuals who are explaining the pros and cons, and most folks know it, and it's on TV, and but it comes out of the Secretary of State's office, as a kind of a legitimate source. And so I'm looking at whether or not that coupled with our voter information guide, would be that. I'm also telling my staff to a certain extent, what can we do on our website that might be more interactive? I don't know what it would look like, but it'd be somebody probably, able to do it, where people could actually go in to look at it and then click on stuff to say, well, does it raise my taxes? Yes or no? Does it do this? Does it do that? And that kind of thing. I think we just need to I just feel like people don't have the information. And they live busy lives, and I don't know why, because these are not just folks who don't read. These are friends and colleagues of mine who will call me and say, what is going on with Prop 15? What is that about versus this versus that? And I said, did you read the information guide? And, it's so confusing. Well, it really isn't. They just didn't want to read it. And they wanted a quick answer from me. And so we have to have a number of ways, I think, to reach the folks to help them understand it, and this is from the Secretary of State's office, that this is what you get, this is what you don't get if you vote this way or that way. And so that people have a real sense of what they're voting for. If they get frustrated, they just vote no. They just vote no. They figure if I vote no, then nothing changes, and that's not always true. Okay, because the way the initiative is set up. So if your frustration is a no frustration, you don't vote. And we can see sometimes the inconsistency in the voting itself, because like we voted down bail, but we voted to let people who are on parole vote. So and who knows, because the parole piece had little or no money, and so it became one of these situations that people, if they could kind of understand it, they knew where they wanted to go, but there's no consistency in terms of ideology as to why one passed and one did not.
I mean, on, a little bit related on this point about how ballot measures are presented, there's often controversies over the title and summary.
Yes.
Are you supportive at all of these proposals that perpetually come up and never go anywhere to take the title and summary writing ability away from the Attorney General and to a nonpartisan source?
I'd like to look at it more carefully. I don't think I'd take it away from the AG, because there is accountability in the AG's office because he is elected. And when you have somebody that's accountable, you have at least one last hammer, okay, which is the election process. When you don't have folks who are accountable, then you may end up with something great and you may not. And I'm not sure if there's anybody in the whole world that's impartial. I just be very honest. I would love to believe that. I think I discussed that in grad school in a philosophy class or in one of my classes concerning the Greeks and the Romans, and I'm not sure if there's any bias, that there's any person on the face of the earth that's impartial. If it's no more than how much time they spend on one question versus the other, so.
Okay, so I have some election-related questions now. One is related to the top two primary.
The what?
The top two primary. There were obviously a lot of incumbents on the ballot for statewide offices and other offices this cycle who got over 50% of the primary, but they're still going on to face, opponents in the general who are maybe got very low amounts of votes in the primary. Do you think this runoff system is the right one for California? Should there be some sort of minimum qualification to make it through to November or anything like that?
I look at it and it may, there's a lot of inequities in the system itself. I think, those, if you get 60% of the vote and you still have to run again against a person who's got a lot less. But you don't know the outcome. So I've never been in favor, first of all, I've never been in favor of the top two and still don't. And I say that because what it proposed to do, it has not done. It has not changed necessarily the outcomes that people thought it would to make it fairer. It also has basically killed off anything other than the two parties. And the intent was that it was open primary. It was going to have all these folks who were in other parties, and we'd have an opportunity to see them. And what it has done is that if you're not a Democrat or Republican, you can see that you're not going to make it to the fall. Okay. And the only way I discovered this because when I first got on, I was running for re-election in school as an assembly member, and I was running unopposed. And I think a week before the election, someone from Peace and Freedom, or one of the parties, the Green Party won, basically filed to run. And I thought, well, what is this all about? Well, because at that point, that person knew, because I was running unopposed, that they would at least get into the general election. And that's the only way the various parties beyond the two could actually get into the general election. And it dawned on me that we had just shut out all these other people in this process, because that was the very beginning kind of the Prop 2 thing. I mean, the top two vote getter. And many people thought it would change this and change that. It really hasn't. Then when you have two of the same party running, all it does is just sends the cost up in terms of who benefits, becomes the consultants and the people who do all the political ads and things like that. So I've never really been into the top two because I saw it killing off these small parties that I thought at least needed to have a voice in the general election to say something. And so I don't have the answer to it, but I know that was not the answer. That was not the answer.
Do you prefer going back to the partisan primary system that we had before, or do you think it's something new entirely is needed? If we went back to the partisan system, it would not be as bad as where we are, period. And we're in a partisan system anyway, okay? You can pretty much predict the outcomes based on the political nature of the state itself. So, especially in California, I don't know any place else, but I know in California. So the other system we had was not a bad system when you think about it, because what was being proposed to us was this was going to be open. You'd have your choices, you'd have this, and what has happened is that people are smart. This is one thing I've learned. People are really, really smart. And they can figure out almost every system we've tried to put in place to trick folks to do something else. I mean, they really are smart. I mean, and I know we're looking at what's this one thing that when you get a whole bunch of people and you rank choice. And I sat in a meeting with some folks. I was not concerning politics, but
I heard some folks, they were running for office and they were in a ranked choice situation. And they had already strategized how to get through the ranked choice. And this is supposed to be the panacea for some places, I guess. And they had already figured out how do you get to become the number one and number two if you ask to be number so-and-so and do this. So folks had already strategized. Maybe those of us who are at the bottom were just, everyday folks just voting your choices. But the people, somebody else had already figured out how to get through it. And so as I tell people, I said, I'm trying to figure out every time you do something that you think is gonna do all of that, we end up almost in the same place, or sometimes a worse place in terms of the damage that is done. So I do know that the prior system we had at least let other people get into the general election, Peace and Freedom, Green Party, whatever, they could get in. They're locked out now.
So, one sort of specific follow-up to this. As you know, in the primary, there were several write-in candidates for the legislature who qualified for November, even though they only got a handful of votes, right? But they were the official write-in candidates, so they got through the top two into November. Would you raise the threshold for those folks to qualify?
I would, I probably wouldn't. And the only reason why I say that is because, like I said, in my case, where somebody came in at the last minute as a write-in candidate, that was their only hope. Someone shut off their only hope of getting to November, I think, especially, when we want to expand out so that people have choices, that we're not just locked into this political two-party drama that goes on and on. It may end up being that way in the end, because maybe that's what the people think. But I don't want to gerrymander it so that it locks people out. And I think that's what happens is when we start tinkering with the things, we generally end up thinking that we can create a perfect system that will respond to things, and then we discover that somebody's already broke the system and figured it out and done all these other things. So I would be very hesitant to put any more restrictions out there because, like I said, I've seen the desperation of people in the other parties who the only way they're going to get on the ballot is as a write-in candidate. And they get a write-in with maybe 30, 40 of their friends who write them in. I mean, I've been, like I said, I ran against a guy who got that. But when he got into the general election, he got people to vote for him who were nonpartisan and who were Republicans or whatever it may be. So why would I shut him out completely when he's actually, or he or she is actually using the only system that we have given them to survive?
I want to ask you as well about the recalls, because after the Gavin Newsom recall election, your office was involved in a lot of the discussion that was happening over the Capitol about how to proceed in rethinking this process, and then nothing ended up coming out of that.
You're absolutely correct.
Are you disappointed with that? And I'm wondering, do you have thoughts about any of the specific proposals that were raised that you think would be the correct path forward? I mean, some of them were increasing the signature requirement, allowing the incumbent to run in the recall, have their name on the ballot, elevating the lieutenant governor automatically if the governor is recalled. Where did you come down in the end on all of that?
Well, we submitted a document to the committee, the committee that had the responsibility to do the legislation. I had been assured that there would be certain things that would be on this coming ballot, and at the last minute, I forgot who it was chaired. Who was the author, basically pulled the bill at the very last minute. So we didn't have opportunity to do anything else. But we are working on it now. And because we had very specific things, I had a separate committee that was made up of a governor and a former Supreme Court justice, and they worked on with a whole bunch of interest groups for me, not because I didn't want to usurp the authority of the legislature to do the legislation, which is their responsibility. And we came up with some recommendations, and some of those recommendations were put forth. And we did come up, the main recommendation that seemed to be the easiest to do, not one of the easiest, but the most agreeable one with everybody, was that the governor's recall should be the question, period. And if he's recalled, not confused, because people spent more time trying to figure out who the other person be. Would it be better? Would it be worse? Blah, 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 blah. And very little conversation occurred about does this man need to be recalled? Has he done something so egregious that we want to remove him from office, okay? So the thing is that, so the initiative that was supposed to have been, that was supposed to go forward was that we supported that the governor's recall, if there's a recall, that would be the question, period. The recall would be the question. If the governor was recalled, then what would happen, because that's what the lieutenant governor's for. I mean, I don't know why we have a lieutenant governor who, if they can't step in when the governor's no longer there. They step in when he goes to Oregon or Arizona, or wherever he goes, so why can't the person step? I mean, that's the purpose of a vice president or a lieutenant governor, is to become the governor in case of emergency. I mean, otherwise, if we're not gonna do that, we don't really need a lieutenant governor. We can let this, we can let the Speaker of the House, who takes over sometimes and signs stuff. So anyway, so the proposal would have been that person would have become governor, number one. And then the second question would have been, then okay, since this is an acting governor, what do we do in terms of getting a governor? And that would be dependent upon, and I don't remember the exact language, how much time was left in that governor's term. So you're not having a governor's a recall, a replacement in June, and then have another election. I mean, we just election out by then. But what would we do in terms of identifying who the new person would be? And it was based on the amount of time left in the office, and how far away from the next election, so that it wouldn't, those kinds of things that we were working out. So, but yeah, that was been the number one thing, because that seemed to be the one thing that most people could agree upon without, and because we didn't have a lot of conversation to go forward, was that particular issue itself, separating it so that you really get a vote yes or no on the recall. And then you have an opportunity to deal with the issue of replacement of the governor. You may have more conversation, more competition. You'd have not only from all the parties would then feel comfortable in running for the new seat. And we would probably end up with someone, we'd have to end up with 50% plus one, rather than the current system we have, which meant, the top vote getter would have been 30%, 20, I don't know what. But in the end, we would not have had a person who had the majority vote of the people. That was the one thing that we realized from that system, that even if there had been a recall, there would have been the vast majority of Californians did not approve that person.
So if I understand correctly, you think that perhaps the best path forward is a recall question that is alone, no question two involving candidates, and then if that person is recalled, then potentially have a special election, or have the lieutenant governor step in as acting governor, and if there's only a very short period of time, wait until the next.
Sure. If you're in the same year, why would you do that? Why would you do another election? So you have the lieutenant governor.
Do you think, is it still worth it then in your mind to try and push this forward for
Yes.
changes in 2024?
Yes, it is worth it, and my staff is working on it now. And I, like I said, I was disappointed that they didn't move forward with it. I discovered they hadn't when I was asking, where's the bill? What are you doing? Because we had given support. And they apologized. I don't know why it wasn't taken forward. But my staff is starting on it now. We hope to have it ready this session. We'll get through it, and hopefully we'll be on the 2024 election time, when we have a lot more time for discussion. There may be other things on there now that, an additional bill with regards to other kinds of aspects of the recall, like do we need to have this versus that. Our recall language is of such that it requires, I think, a little bit more discussion of if there's a replacement, what would you ask the replacement? In other words, what would they have to submit in terms of an election, and pay, whether signatures, whether we're going to do do they have the same qualifications that the governor has to have, who stepped down? Those kinds of things would be important. As well as they're looking at the number of signatures needed for it. Would we base it on the last election, or would we base it on the percentage? We may not increase the percentage, but would the percentage be based on the number of registered voters versus those who voted in the last election? Because you find a low voter turnout like we had in this June, and then you use that as a base, and then you got issues. Okay, so we want to make sure that at least that we're responding to it. Some states have much higher percentages, like 25%. Some don't have it at all because they have an impeachment process, and I think that's the best process to go through to basically, if you're going to remove a governor or any constitutional officer, that you need to go through a process, because there need to be a cause. And that's also one of the issues. Should the person who takes out petitions have to identify a cause and have a hearing on cause before you go forward with the impeachment.
So do you support either of those proposals? Would you support increasing the requirements to actually qualify the initiative or having a specific cause? I mean, things like that. Do you think it's too easy to qualify a recall?
I don't know if it's too easy. I mean, you got to have money. It's no question you got to have money in the current process. So I'm not sure it's too easy. I would definitely make it based on the number of registered voters. And that would be so that you would not have to find folks who are waiting for the lowest election time. Maybe it's a year, mid-year, and it's non-controversial, to the extent that those who are running are going to win. And so therefore people get like, I'm not going to go vote because it's a done deal kind of attitude. And there'd be a low voter turnout, okay? And so you wait for that, and then you use that as the base, to respond. And then you ask everybody to vote on it. So for me, at least you should be making the numbers based not on the last election, but on the number of registered voters in California. And to me, that would be a much fair and more reasonable thing, so that you're kind of trying to make it so that people don't spend time trying to game the system, which is what generally happens, a lot. And you can't prevent all of that. I understand that, but you can probably try to minimize some of it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think we have one question.
So moving into election security, how concerned are you about voter fraud?
I think everyone is concerned about it simply because we have to have a concern. We don't have a lot of it in California. We have such an enormous system of check and balances and checking systems and so forth and so on and those kinds of things that we don't have a lot of examples of voter fraud, or even people may allege there's voter fraud, but then there's no evidence and material that we have. But you're always concerned, and I think you have to stay concerned, because if you ever get to the point where you're not concerned and you're not looking at everything and you're not listening to everything, then that's when you end up with a number of problems.
So based on that, do you have any plans or strategies if you're elected to a second term to deal with any voter fraud that does seem to pop up?
Well, anytime there's voter fraud, immediately we have a whole cybersecurity office and a number of other things that go into place to go into work to make sure that it's not true. So and that is a standard office in Secretary of State's office, and we do that on a regular basis. So we do that. We make sure that there is none. Even, like I said, even if someone comes with us with allegation, we have a process in place that we deal with it. So we handle it, and it's a large operation, and we have lots of folks who are in there working constantly around the issue of voter misinformation, voter fraud, allegations that are there. Oftentimes, as soon as it happens, my staff is in place looking at it to make sure that it's not true, And if it is, then we have to basically prosecute people who have been engaged in voter fraud. And which is not an easy thing to do, because you have to make sure there's intent and all those other things that go along with it. But we've dealt with some, yeah.
So you have prosecuted people since you've been in office?
No, not me. But we did, every now and then there is something that happens that people will allege that certain things have took place, and as a result we go through the process and look to see what really happened. And sometimes it's a fluke, sometimes it's just a clerical issue with individuals and names and things like that, yeah.
So your office hasn't had to prosecute anyone?
Not that I know of, but I wouldn't swear about it, because we are in the process of everything. I'm telling you, we are being sued every day, every day about everything. And I've learned a lot about all kinds of groups, and I've been accused of treason, and what else? I'm trying to think of a whole bunch of stuff. Some sovereign nation. I just finally learned who sovereign nations are, who these sovereign people are. But I mean, so I've had a little bit of everything in a short period of time, because this is a very very unique time in elections. Secretaries of state are no longer these folks just kind of happily going through election process and dealing with business filings. There's something that happens every day. And but that's why we have attorneys to basically help us and deal with the issues. But there's a lot that goes on. There's a lot.
Now, I know this happened before your term, but in 2020, the the California Republican Party did admit to, placing drop boxes that said they were official, although they were not actually official. And, I believe the Secretary Padilla at the time sent a cease and desist letter, and the Secretary of State's office was going to continue to monitor. I was just curious if there have been any other incidents like that, or if there's been any activity about those drop boxes.
Not really. When I saw it, I realized that it probably emanated from a piece of legislation that we had that dealt with drop boxes. That when I was on the elections committee, I was one of the members on the committee, and this seemed to be an effort at a stunt to try to emphasize, look, this is so crazy, I could make my own box and collect, that kind of stuff. They didn't collect any ballots, and in the end, they took them down, but it was really more of a political kind of theater that engaged in. Our drop boxes now are for these humongous things. I'm sure some of you have seen them on the campuses. So if you can pick up one of those, you are definitely the Hulk and his friends all put together, because it's screwed in the ground. but no, that I just assumed when I was in the office, I just assumed based on what I had seen in committees and on our committee that this was really a political stunt to say, look, it's so easy, you can make your own box and collect signatures and do what you want, collect ballots and do what you want with them. And it was important that Padilla did a cease and desist letter and what have you, so that people would know that this is not just for fun, that if you do something like this, this is serious and there are consequences for it.
In general, do you feel that it's a challenge for the state to balance making voting more accessible but still keeping it secure?
There's always a balance that has to be there. We have to make sure that those who legitimately can vote get a chance to vote, and that they have the opportunity to vote, and that every vote counts. So that there's no question about that. A state of this size has lots of things that happen on election day, whether it's electricity going out in some place and us having to, move somebody from one place to the other. But we have so many contingencies plans that we generally don't deny anybody the opportunity to vote. But it is a huge issue, and like I said, any question we have is always responded to quickly, because we're in a period of enormous allegations and issues that are brought forward. And so we don't take any of them lightly, but we try to respond to them quickly so that they don't spread, because there are those who would find obviously conspiracies and things in everything that we do. And there are those who still in the state think that we should count every ballot by hand. And you can only imagine what, even if you're in an organization and you got 50 voters, you got 3-4 people counting, and it ends up, what did you get, 47? What did you get, 43? Then you have to go back and do it again. You can imagine if we had to count 22 million ballots by hand. We would definitely be slower than Paul Revere in his message around the country. It would take us an enormous amount of time, and yet there are those who advocate for that, and they're serious. So I don't know what you do about that, other than we know that's not possible. Yeah.
How concerned are you about threats to election workers, and did you support the new law that allows them to keep their addresses confidential?
I'm very concerned about that, and one of the first things I said to our election officials in a meeting that we're in is that, these folks are serving our state, oftentimes making so little money, our poll workers. It's ridiculous. My mother was a poll worker. Our house was a polling place in Los Angeles. And so, and I saw the women who came in and who worked at those polls. They were proud to be a poll worker. The work they did was a tremendous service to the city of Los Angeles. And to have those people attacked and people threaten them, to me, it's just, it's unfortunate, it's desperate, but it's something that we have to assure them that we will protect them. And so we did add them to our Safe at Home project, so that their materials can be kept away from others that are there. I've said to our election officials, when we had some issues with people trying to bully folks or push people in, push into offices and things like that in some of our communities, that my office, along with the AG's office, will prosecute anybody to the fullest extent of the law if they're attacking poll workers, if they're attacking our registrar voters. Because that really, if you allow that to happen, you really get to begin to destroy the democracy. Because if people feel that they can't participate either as a voter or as a person who works the poll in a really honest and impartial way, then our system will crumble. It will crumble because people will be afraid, and there's nothing worse than fear. For people to, and we don't want our poll workers or anyone to basically fear serving, doing a good service of working at the polls. So, I've made that fairly clear to our election officials in all of the counties when I met with them about it. And I said, I understand what fear is, and I understand the power of fear and how it can really erode the process and how it can cause people to do things that they would normally not do out of fear for themselves. No one should be afraid to vote. No one should ever be afraid to work in our polls. No one should ever be afraid to stand up for democracy. And those of us who have responsibility for some of those things have a responsibility to make sure those people feel safe and secure.
One of the issues that, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to talk over anyone. You had mentioned earlier your office had been taking some steps to combat election disinformation. I was wondering if you could talk about that and what further steps you might take in a second term.
Well, what we've been doing, and I think it's what we can legally do at this point, is that we have a team of folks who basically look at all the information that comes out, social media and what have you. And this is their job, 24/7, as well as any information that comes to us from other sources. They'll track down, and then we figure out the source. We find out the correct answer. Our response is to try to get the correct answer to the social media platform, to the individuals who are putting it out there, and give them an opportunity to take it down and correct it themselves. And so that's what we've done, and we continue to do that. And it's been relatively effective in dealing with a lot of questions that people come up with that really aren't, or rumors that they hear about what's taking place that really is not true. So our stance is to provide the correct information that people should have if the issues are being raised. How can we correct that information and give the correct information to the public?
I guess a little bit on this, one of the causes of an increasing amount of anxiety around elections and disinformation is the fact that sometimes the votes can take so long to come in, and people see these numbers changing for weeks after the election and they don't understand why. Is there anything that you think the state can or should be doing to speed up the count and reporting of election results? I mean, recognizing that we have a huge amount of ballots to get through, we still take much longer than other large states like Texas or Florida to count and report all of
Well, we count all ballots, that's probably why. But anyway, aside from that, we're seeing, I think we're seeing it a little faster now, but we have to wait till all the stuff gets in. That's just, we know what the results are, because you can see it unless you've got a really, really, really tight race. So we know what they are. But it would be, our position is that we're not going to call the election. You guys will call it first. The media always tells us who won, but we have to count every ballot. And so by statute, we have to do that. We have to count every ballot. We have 30 days to get this stuff done, what have you. But most folks know that the election has been done. People have received letters that you've been elected to so-and-so, come to so-and-so on December 5th and be sworn in, all those things. It will probably happen a lot faster now, but that we have absentee ballots, vote by mail ballots. And people can, we can start counting those early. In fact, when you turn on your TV, the first report that comes out is really all those absentee ballots that have already been counted. And so we do start the process early in terms of that. We don't announce it, because if you announce it, obviously, then you're going to deter people from going to the polls. They don't want, oh, it's already done. I think that happened once when people announced something that happened in D.C. and people in California just didn't go because the president had already been chosen, not thinking about the down ballot individuals and others that are still running. So we try not to call it until obviously after 8 o'clock and after all the polls are closed. We'll tell you what the first count is, and it doesn't always change that much, a little bit, especially if it's a close election. But we do that. We'll probably be faster because we do get more vote by mail ballots coming in. And in fact, in the last special elections, almost the whole group was basically vote by mail, and it was a small percentage in LA and some other places that came in afterwards that actually walked into the polls and turned in their ballot that day. Yeah. So we hope to, most folks know who won before before the day is over, really. I mean, by the next morning, people are celebrating and crying at the same time, so, we know that's gonna happen. But we're committed to making sure that every vote counts. And in close elections, you almost can't do anything about it. I've been in small elections and where the difference has been 50 votes in favor of somebody, they won that night, next morning they were down and somebody else won by 10 and you go back and forth because you gotta count every ballot. Yeah.
I have one more question, I think.
Yeah, I know we're coming up on time. I did want to ask, as Secretary of State, what can you do to fix issues with CalAccess and other data platforms? And is there a timeline for the replacement project?
There is a time. I'm not sure if there's a timeline. I think it's probably next 3 to 4 years, I believe, that the CalAccess should be completely fixed. We're working on it. It's an unfortunate. One of the hard decisions of my administration was dealing with CalAccess. It was a system that was not going to work. And I didn't know that until I got all the data that came in. And I could have let it go out and you guys would have still would probably been complaining even more that, this thing starts and it doesn't work. And
So why is it taking so long? I mean, that's,
You know
I
what
guess
I
the
would
question
love?
everyone has.
Well, I tried my best to try to track down where this project started and ended and started and ended and started and changed, okay? I can't tell you, because I'm not into the blaming game, I can't tell you who did what and who shot what. What I do know is that when I entered the office, eventually I made some statements like, the worst thing I hate in life is for people to say, I started to tell you, but. And then they don't tell me, and then things fall apart. I hate that. At least give me a chance to run. But anyway, so as a result, I had folks in coming to me and sharing with me the user effectiveness of the project, and it never got over 40%. It was in the 30s, and I was concerned. And so I had a month of meetings with all the folks involved in the project. And some were saying, that there was a whole lot of problems with it, and some of those putting it together felt it was fine enough to go forward. And in the end, though, after much questions and much discussions, everyone agreed that it was not ready, even those who said it was initially. So I had to have some, and no one could tell me why, and no one can tell me when, and no one could tell me what the problem was, okay? So I had to hire an outside person to come in and give us information on the project. And it took them 6 months to assess the project, to determine what could be salvaged, what could not, where we're going with it. And we did some work during that time with some data transference and what have you. But in the end, the company that we hired came back with a report, and I think we shared it with everybody as to what we needed to do. And we're in the process of doing that now. And so we're trying to accelerate the timeline as much as possible. I could have, like I told folks, and the difference was with our CBC project, our business project, the technology project, initially they also came to me and said, it's not going to be ready to launch. We can't, it's not ready. We have some issues. But they could say, but when I said, where are we in the project? They could tell me. I said, where are we? And they were at step 4 and we need to get to step 5 or something like that. I can't remember the extra number. And I said, well, what's necessary? And they could tell me what was necessary. And then I could say, well, how long would it take? They could tell me it was 6 months or more. I said, could you do it in 3? They could tell me how they could do it in 3, okay? Through more staff, more this, more hours, whatever it was. And in the end, they did it in 3, okay? But they could tell me that. So when I got to the CARS project and I said, where are we? Where are we in the process? No one could tell me. I said, what is necessary? What's left? Nobody could say you got 3 steps left. You got, I couldn't, and nobody knew either. And so I don't know where the project started. I know it went different directions and one thing another. And so it was a difficult decision because I realized at that point, it would be, if I let it out, then I could blame everybody else. And I'm not a blamer, I'm a person who tries to solve the problem. And so I had to do what I had to do. And that was one of the hardest decisions I had to do, was to stop the project. Because I assumed coming in, everybody tells me it's ready, it's going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread, blah, blah, blah. And then when I saw the user testing data, and I said, and it wasn't going up, and it wasn't getting better. And normally, like with CBC, the user test, it was like 98, 96, whatever it was when we got ready to launch. This was not. And so I just said, okay, that will be, and somebody says, well, will you promise to do it during your term? I said, well, will you promise to reelect me? I mean, you know, it's one of those kind of things. But in the end, you know, I said, you know, we're putting everything that we got into it. We've restructured some things with it. We finally got the California Department of Technology. I thought CDT was involved in it. They were not. So now they're involved in the project, okay, and those kinds of things. So we put in place the things that hopefully will strengthen it, make it work for California, and those kinds of things. But it was not something that I wanted to do at all. But it's like one of the things, you walk into a job and it's there, you know, and what do? You know, I'm not running for something else, and I'm not running away. So it's something that I had to deal with.
Can I ask one more question?
I gotta go.
Okay.
And I think I gotta go ahead.
Okay, last question. Before you left the legislature, you passed this law to create the Reparations Task Force, which has been getting a lot of attention. Are you satisfied with the work that the task force has done so far? And do you have any concerns about, you know, this back and forth this year about whether they should get more time, take more time, all that kind of stuff?
You know, I'm very supportive and appreciate the work that they've done. The documents that they've produced, the people they've interviewed have been really good. They had requested more time, and there may still be an opportunity to request more time. My concern was not the time, and that the fact that they wanted an extra 4 to 6 months to get information out or what have you might have been reasonable. My opposition to the bill concerning time was because at the 11th hour, something was thrown into that bill that was not a part of it, and that was to give the authority to take people off the commission. I thought that would be detrimental if people served on a commission and felt that their opinions may cause them to lose their place on the commission because maybe the governor or the speaker or whoever else did not want to have that information. A commission of that nature should have the ability to honestly address the issue and not be concerned about the elected officials who appointed them. So that became an item of concern for me, and had been earlier when folks had tried to take folks off commissions because they didn't like decisions. And I felt it was more of a principal issue with regards to commissions and their independence. And there was no alternative to that other than to ask for a veto of that bill. It may come back, but if it does, it will come back the way it should have been in the first place, which it was about time. And like I said, at the 11th hour, this bill was changed without any of our knowledge. And when we looked up, and you know, right at the deadline, and we ended up with this. And so most folks know I'm not afraid to take hard decisions, and I'm not afraid to be unpopular, and I'm not afraid to call it as it is. And so I asked for a veto of that bill because of that. I thought it set a bad precedent for any commission that would come afterwards.
Okay, great. Well, we really appreciate you coming in and spending this time
Well,
with us.
thank you. I feel great to come to your new offices and see all your nice new equipment. You guys have grown up fast. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.